Cells, the living units. The cell is the smallest unit of life. Anything less complex than the most basic cell is not considered to be alive. A cell is made up of many things, right? It has a membrane, it's got a nucleus, it's got a bunch of organelles in there. No one component of the cell is considered alive. Only when they all come together and are able to independently perform a certain list of tasks can something be considered alive. All life must be able to, or in order to be considered alive, you must be able to consume, eat, drink, whatever. You have to be able to take in nutrients. You have to be able to do something with those nutrients too. There's no point in consuming something unless you can metabolize them and use them for some source. So eat, drink, etc., and also use that for energy. Living things might also take their energy from other sources too. For example, plant cells use energy taken from the sun to help fuel certain processes, but they also have to take in other nutrients. And with a combination of those things, the carbon dioxide that they take in from the air, the nitrogen and things that they take in from the soil, only in combination can they go forth and have other and maintain themselves and make other cells. On that same note, all cells must be able to reproduce, make more of themselves. This could be by cloning, just dividing and making another one of yourself, like when cells divide. It could be something as complex as sexual reproduction. You have two completely independent organisms that match up some of their new cells and then make a totally unique, genetically shuffled person or an organism out of it. You have to be able to consume on your own. You have to be able to reproduce either on your own or with another of your same species. So a bacterium with another of the same kind of bacterium, a chicken with a chicken, a person with a person. And you must have arisen from other cells. All life comes from other life. This is a really important concept, and it's fundamental to basic rules of biology. For a long time, it was thought that life could spring out of nowhere. A lot of very sophisticated experiments especially mostly the Renaissance, helped show us that life could only spring from other life. So now that we have these rules, let's think about some different types of what we consider living things. I'm going to erase all this so I have some room. Okay, so let's think about a bacterium. E. coli, let's pretend, right? So E. coli, does it consume anything? Yes, you can grow E. coli on a petri dish. If you can grow it on a petri dish, it's because it's consuming, it's eating stuff that's built into the petri dish. So bacterium can consume. Check. Can it reproduce? Can you get sick with one E. coli, or does it have to start to divide and take over before you get sick? It has to start to divide and take over before you get sick. It can make more of itself. Check. Does any E. coli spring up out of the blue, or does it come from other E. coli cells? Yeah, it comes from other E. coli cells. What about a fungus? Think about like the mold that's growing on the package of hot dog buns downstairs in my kitchen that I haven't touched in a frighteningly long time. So fungus or mold. Does it consume? Yeah, it's eating the sugars out of the bread that I've left downstairs. It's also consuming some of the moisture that's in that bag. We don't really eat anything that's truly completely dry. There's some amount of moisture in everything, including things that we do think of as being dry, like flour or bread. Does it reproduce? Considering that that mold was not there a week and a half ago when I last opened up that bag, it must have been there in the first place, at least in small amounts. And it must have grown, it must have divided, it must have made more of itself to take over like that. If the fungal growth on my bread represented just those cells that were already there getting bigger, I'd be able to see individual huge cells. That's not the case. Instead, they've divided and spread. They have food, they have oxygen, they have water, therefore they can live, therefore they can reproduce. The sole goal of all living things from an evolutionary standpoint is to reproduce. Everything else is an accessory to that. But so, point being, took over my bread. Yep, sure did reproduce. Did it arise from other cells? Yes. Everything that you eat has a certain amount of what you would otherwise consider contamination already on it. Nothing that you eat is sterile. Sterile means that something is completely free from all life. There's no bioburden on it whatsoever. There's not even a single bacterium or a single fungal spore on that whole thing. In reality, we can't actually prove that that ever exists. Our world is filled with germs and living things in our environment, in the air, on the surfaces. But we can get close enough to matter. Our food is not held to that standard. So there was some fungus on the bread when it got in the bag. If you eat it fast enough, it's not a big deal. You only have a handful of fungal spores that you're eating, and your body can take care of that. Your stomach acid will burn that away. So those fungal spores, I couldn't see them before, but they were there. They have divided, and now I can see them. Yes, it arose from other cells. Let's erase this. What else? Let's think of a virus. We're all sort of becoming experts in virology with COVID, right? So let's think about a virus. The 3 criteria is consume, just write this out in advance this time, reproduce, or arise from other cells. Well, we know that it can arise from other cells, or it can arise somehow from some other form of life because it infects our cells. It gets in, it makes more of itself, it uses our cells to make more of itself. So it does arise from other cells, and it does use your cell's machinery to make viruses out of a pre-existing virus. A virus comes into the cell, it hijacks your cell's ordinary machinery to make more of itself, and then it spews out a bunch of virus particles. So in a weird way, a virus doesn't just arise from one copy of itself, but it also kind of arises out of the new cell. It emerges, at least, from this new infected cell. So yes, it does arise from other cells. It comes in, hijacks the cell's machinery to make more of itself. That sounds like reproduction, right? Remember that our criteria was you have to be able to reproduce itself, reproduce by itself, or with another of the same species. Human to human is sexual reproduction does count in this definition of reproduction. A bacterial cell just dividing, just cloning itself, so that there was one cell, it copies all its DNA, now it's 2 cells, is also reproduction. It's reproduction by itself. The virus, so I'm going to take these cells right here, they're actually skin cells, in just like a nice thin pretty layer, but we'll pretend that there's something that COVID could infect. So what COVID is going to do, boo, is it's going to work its way into the cell, hijack the cell's machinery, and then make more viruses. Right? Did it reproduce itself, or did this other cell do all of the operations of reproduction for it? The cell did it. The virus did not reproduce itself. When you're thinking about epidemiology or public health stuff, you want to remember that a virus does not reproduce by itself. If you cut off the virus from the type of cells it can infect, it will die out. It will become extinct. You can do that by either preventing transmission in the first place, by isolating those cells, or if I have COVID, for example, by just locking me in my room and not letting me get out until I'm completely free of virus. That's an effective way of preventing those variants from being transmitted to anybody else. Or you can create a situation inside of the organism that's hostile to viral reproduction. So a vaccination is supposed to do just that. You could potentially get exposed to a certain virus, but once it's in, your immune system is going to knock it out before, I mean, maybe you get a little sick, but it'll certainly knock it out so that you're not going to be shedding a ton of virus after the fact. That's a really successful great vaccine. Those tricks only work because the virus can't reproduce itself, or they only work as well as they do. So a virus cannot reproduce. Does a virus consume anything? The virus, once again, I'm not going to draw the whole sun rays part of the virus, of the coronavirus. Here's my frowny face virus. Comes into the cell, hijacks the cell's machinery, and makes more of itself. Those cells are eventually going to try to exit the cell. Now it's out. It's going to try to latch onto something else, a new cell of the same type, do the same trick. And then that's going to try to get out and do it to a new cell. At any point in this chain, do you see this virus eating anything, drinking anything, using oxygen or carbon dioxide from the environment, bringing in atoms of any kind? No, you don't. A virus does not consume anything. Finish erasing this. It does not consume. A virus is not in and of itself alive. It does perform life-like functions. So it does sort of seem like it's alive, but it lacks any of the things that you have to be able to do independently to be able to consider it alive. So it does perform lifelike functions, is not sufficiently independent to be considered life. Now, in case the viruses interest you and you start reading about this stuff, I will say that this is a little bit contentious within the field of particularly like evolutionary biology. So you'll have some people arguing passionately that viruses are alive because they can perform some of these things. You also have a lot of viruses of varying complexity, and we're discovering a lot of new what's called megaviruses that are we're finding a lot in like thawing permafrost that are coming that we can access because the Arctic is melting. And these are huge molecules. They're almost the size of a regular cell. And they have a lot of internal components that make it seem like maybe it could have done more lifelike stuff in its time. So there's shades of gray of complexity of viruses, and it's still a little bit of an open question. But for the viruses that we interact with on a day-to-day basis, what it really just is you have a protein shell. You may or may not, and I'll just draw squiggly lines, have a lipid bilayer inside or outside of it, like a cell membrane kind of a thing. You maybe have a few proteins, and you have genetic material. You've got protein spikes on the outside that let it interact with other things, and that's it. That's a virus. There's no organelles that can sustain metabolism. There's no enzymes or protein-style machinery that can completely reproduce the virus by itself. It has some of them sometimes, but it needs the other cell to be able to finish the job for it. So therefore, the virus is not, for our purposes, certainly for our purposes, considered to be alive. There are trillions of cells in the human body, of more than 250 types of cells, and they can be quite different from one another. When you're looking at tissues or thinking about organs and trying to consider what their role is in the body, what they do, what they're going to help make, how they're going to bring things in or release things, you should try to look at what the cell is made of and how it looks from the outside. How it looks is going to tell you what it does. Form follows function. You have a task that you need to do, and your being will take on a shape, will be evolutionarily inclined over millennia, millions of years to end up with a shape that is most conducive to that role. So erythrocytes, for example, are red blood cells. Red blood cells. And they have, if you look at one straight down, like on the round side of it, it has this sort of donut-y appearance where the outside is solid and the inside is translucent. It's not hollow, it's not like a donut hole in the middle, but it's a lot thinner inside the middle. It's like if you took a dinner roll between your two fingers and then just squished your two fingers together. You don't make a hole in the roll exactly, but you do kind of make this concave shape to it, right? Erythrocytes' whole job is to hold on to as much hemoglobin as possible, because hemoglobin is the molecule that our body makes to carry oxygen. Red blood cells move around the body to drop off oxygen to cells that need it and pick up their waste carbon dioxides and bring it to the lungs to get rid of it. So a few key features of red blood cells are this shape, for one. This makes it so that it can actually bend a little bit more easily than if it were a rigid structure. Sorry, these are disappearing a little bit. You can pinch it and bend it, and you have more surface area. Remember, surface area is important in life because basically everything happens across a membrane. The more membrane you can pack into a certain volume, the more surface you can pack into a certain volume, the more opportunities you have to do stuff. If things only happen across membranes, it behooves you to pack on membranes. So membrane length anyway. So this increases the surface area of the cell, and it provides it a flexibility so that it can get through the tiniest little capillaries and make sure that every single cell in your body gets that oxygen. By being sort of a flat shape and not an overall round shape, it means that any given hemoglobin molecule is really close to the surface. Again, since everything happens along membranes, that means that every hemoglobin molecule is really close to where it needs to be to get rid of its oxygen. At no point do we worry about hemoglobin being so deep inside the cell that when it releases its oxygen, it just can't get out. It's too far. And one more thing is that a mature red blood cell, if you look at it under a microscope, it just has that sort of like donut-y kind of appearance. You never see a nucleus. There is no nucleus in a mature red blood cell. Red blood cells, when they're babies, right, when they're stem cells and immature red blood cells, they have a nucleus. They need to be making things and doing things and building things and consuming things. But their end task is simply to be bags of hemoglobin to pick up oxygen and dump off oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide. It does that best by getting rid of as much as it can on the inside so that it can fit more hemoglobin in there. And so eventually it sheds its nucleus. So no nucleus. Sperm have the character, I mean, you know what a sperm looks like. You have this head, you have like a little collar here, and then you have a tail. What does a sperm do? It has to go from the male reproductive system into the female reproductive system, find an oocyte, penetrate the oocyte, get in, and then release its genetic material. It's helpful then to have a, not aerodynamic, what's the word I'm looking, well, you know what I mean, aerodynamic kind of a shape so that it can move through space fairly easily. Streamlined contours. This collar here is really just sort of like a holder-on type of bit of protein. And this tail that spins around and around generates a bit of a spiral and propels the whole thing forward. It goes like a tadpole, effectively. So this enables the output of the male reproductive system so that it does not have to be on the ovum. You see, there's a lot of animals, and you've seen nature programs where like one animal releases all of its eggs into like a puddle, and then the other animal releases all of its sperm into a puddle, and then they kind of have to, they just mingle and sit there. This shape enables organisms to not require that amount of contact. If you're having sex, ejaculate doesn't hit your ovum exactly. It's not like the ovum is right there in your vagina. There's space that it has to travel. And this helps it go. It also, because it has this some sort of pointed tip, and it has certain molecular markers on that tip too, it's able to penetrate an oocyte with a minimal amount of resistance. So you've got that. It's got that going for it, right? Adipocytes are fat cells. And what those look like are big, round cells that look mostly clear. They have a little bit of a yellow sheen to it. They look mostly clear except for this flat, squashed nucleus and maybe a little bit of other organelle type stuff crammed off to one side. An adipocyte's job is to hold on to fat and then release it when your body needs that energy. Pure and simple. And the more fat it can pack into itself, the better it's doing its job. So as this fat cell takes up fat, it's going to end up pulling it into like this vacuole, this big open bubble in the middle. And the more full that gets, the more those organelles are going to get crammed up off to the side. Fat has a little bit of a yellowy appearance, so the cell overall has kind of a yellowish, but otherwise like a clear, faint yellowish glow. Holds on to fat, looks like just a big fat blob of fat, but with a little bit of, you know, it still has to do some basic stuff, so it still has a nucleus and stuff off to the side. Final example, nerve cells have this spiky head where the nucleus is, like the main cell body. And then it has a tail. And then it has this sort of like cat o' nine tails ending to it. A nerve cell's job is to pick up neurotransmitters, pick up chemicals, convert those chemicals into electrical energy, zap the electrical energy to something else, and then use that electrical energy to release a chemical signal. It's this back and forth process of chemical to electricity, to chemical to electricity, to chemical to electricity. So at the head here, this is the receiving end, the soma. You have the ends of other nerve cells close by to any one of these spiky parts called dendrites. The more spikes you have and the more sort of offshoots to those spikes, and we'll learn the proper terms for this stuff later, the more surface area that cell has to pick up neurotransmitters. Great. All that energy, the little small electrical jolts that are created there, are going to accumulate, and they need to go down the length of this tail. So you have this funnel shape here to kind of gather up all that energy. The tail is long, homogeneous, and it has some extra accessories to make it extra efficient. But it's like a cable in your walls or something. Once that electrical energy has gathered and is high enough, it can zap straight down the line. Finally, at the end, you have these little balls at the end of those tails of your neuron that are going to then release neurotransmitter to a new neuron who can send its new signal down to something else. If the nerve cell didn't have that long tail, you would have to transmit that signal from one cell body to another cell body to another cell body that are all mashed up together in exactly the right configuration. It would be a slow process because you'd have to accumulate the signal and then finally send it, and then accumulate it all over from scratch and finally send it to go any kind of distance. It also severely limits how much signal you can spread. You can only pack so many cell bodies around one another. You can pack a lot, see now this is getting really cluttered, but you can pack a lot of these axons next to each other because they're flat and round. And they can all then split off and go other places. This is a very, very efficient way for a nerve cell, a neuron, to be arranged. If it were arranged any different way, it would be dramatically more inefficient, and it might not even work at all. The major parts of the cell start with the plasma membrane on the outside. That's this sort of light blue part out here, which completely encloses organelles suspended in liquid. The space inside the plasma membrane overall is the cytoplasm. The liquid that's filling all this space in between organelles is the cytosol. Each organelle, each of these things that you see inside of the cell, the big purple thing here, the squiggly coral looking blue thing, the little orange beans, each one of those are different organelles. They're all small, discrete functional units of the cell, discrete being separate from one another. They all have their own unique and necessary place in the cell, necessary role in the cell. They do something that the cell needs, and nothing else does it quite the same way that it does. Individually, as I mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, organelles in and of themselves are not living. A virus is a bag of protein with some DNA in it. That's it. It is not in and of itself alive. The nucleus is a ball of protein with a bunch of DNA in there. It is not alive. Your DNA by itself, which is packed, well, actually it's packed in here. Sorry. Your DNA is just a string of atoms. It can't consume anything. It can't reproduce itself. You need a bunch of other stuff in the cell to do that trick for it. It is not in and of itself alive. Your endoplasmic reticulum, that's basically just like a wavy little layer of fat cells with some protein stuck to it, not in and of itself alive. The only exception, sort of, to that is the mitochondrion. And we'll talk more about the mitochondrion later on. But the long and short of it is, forever and a day ago in evolutionary time, these used to be independent bacteria that lived fine on their own, they were consumed at some point by a bigger, like an archaeon or something. And it turned out that they had a benefit. It turned out to be a beneficial arrangement. That alpha proteobacteria ended up excreting stuff that the archaeon ended up being able to use, and it made it more efficiently than the archaeon could. Also, being trapped inside of an archaeon, which is pretty resistant to changes in the environment, protected the alpha proteobacteria. And eventually, this symbiotic relationship perpetuated. And now we have this separate kind of life called eukaryotes, which you remember from introductory biology, that have, a loosey-goosey outside, a plasma membrane. You have a nucleus, and then you have these nice mitochondria on the inside that makes a great deal of the energy for the cell. The cell requires the mitochondrion. It's evolved over time to get rid of a bunch of stuff it didn't need, since the mitochondrion can do it for it. So the overall cell needs the mitochondrion to make energy, and the mitochondrion lost a bunch of its genetic material on the way that it didn't need because it was being protected by the big cell. Absolutely needs the rest of the cell to survive. So they end up moving forward as one organism.